Welcome, everyone, to our third installment with Peter Kupfer and the Glassmaker's son. We're happy to have Peter back again. And let me just, for those of you who haven't joined before, let me give you a little bit of background on Peter. Peter is a writer and editor and photographer based in San Francisco, California, USA. His articles on arts and culture, business and technology, and travel have appeared in leading newspapers, magazines, websites, including the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and the New York Observer. Welcome back to our week of important podcasts with Peter and his new book, The Glassmaker's Son. So welcome back for our third section. And Peter, let's talk about the letters that you found in a box in your father's house. So let's start there.
Yeah, sure. Several years, or shortly after my dad died in 1976, I happened upon a box in my parents' attic that had, a parcel of letters. And as I went through them, I discovered that these were both correspondence between my father and his father, who was still in Germany. And the period of these letters was around 1940. Well, they were all in 1941, actually. And in these letters, it showed my father's and my grandfather's efforts to get my grandfather out of Germany, and sort of the increasing urgency that were reflected in the letters and in their efforts, which were unfortunately futile. But they tried many different options, to book a passage on ships from Germany, from Spain, from France, and worked with many different agencies, and these all came out in the letters. And in addition to the correspondence between my father and grandfather, there were also many letters my father wrote to various shipping agencies and immigration services and lawyers, all these different efforts that they were trying to make to rescue my grandfather from Germany.
So when did the letter writing begin and when did it end?
There were only about a dozen letters, and they began, I believe, in March of 1941, and the last one was in November of 41.
So if I can help you relive those stories, what was the first letter and what was the surprising part of some of these letters? And maybe we can, how many letters were there, did you say?
There were about a dozen letters.
So maybe we can drill into some of these letters and what are the surprises, what are the historical learnings that you had, maybe some personal things that came out of those letters that you were not aware of from before?
Well, one of the things that I learned that I hadn't realized before was that, my grandfather lived in a small city in Bavaria originally. That's where my father grew up. And in 1939, he was forced, my grandfather, who had a very nice house in this small city, a rather large house, was forced to sell it under the Nazi policies that, basically, Jews were not allowed to own any property at a certain point. So he was forced to sell his home, and he and his sister, who he was living with, were moved to Frankfurt. So the letters, and this was rather common for a lot of Jews who were forced to move. They tended to migrate to larger cities because they were less conspicuous there. And also because I think the Nazis created Judenhauses, or Jewish houses, for Jews who were then later deported. So anyway, the letters showed that he actually had to move several times because he was being evicted from one apartment after another, or they didn't have the funds to pay the rent. So that was one of the things that came out in the letters that I found.
Was your
that-
grandfather of well health, or was he have illnesses as well?
As far as I knew, his health was good, but also the letters reflected the fact that his health seemed to deteriorate over the course of that 9 months of correspondence. And there was one letter where he said, if we are ever lucky enough if you are ever lucky enough to reunite with your father, you will meet a very scrawny man. So, he was obviously reflecting on the fact that they didn't have many resources and they weren't eating well. They were being forced to move several times over that 9-month period until they finally ended up in a Judenhaus where they were deported in August of 1941. And also, another surprising thing about the letters well, not surprising, but interesting, was that he was talking about trying to learn English because he didn't know English. And, he was saying in preparation for his reunion with my father, who was, I don't know if I already mentioned it, he had emigrated to the United States in 1938. So he was writing to my father, who was in the United States in New Haven, Connecticut, where he had immigrated to. But my grandfather was saying, I'm trying to learn English, and I'm also trying to learn how to cook so that he'll be able to, provide some help to my father when he came. And he was saying, it's not going very well. It's hard to get those things into an old head. And because my grandfather he wasn't that old. He was, at that point, he was in his late 60s. So yeah, he was getting older.
So was your father married to your mother when these letters were going on?
No, my father immigrated to the States in 38, and he didn't get married till 46. He didn't meet my mother till the early 40s, mid 40s.
So, I think it's an interesting discussion that we're having because we share some common interests here and some common history. Your father was from Bavaria. My father was born in 1921 in Berlin. He was much younger than your father. My father escaped Nazi Berlin in 1936 when he was only 15. He went on the last Hadassah Aliyot pass. And his father, my grandfather, was a World War I soldier of distinction. Now, when my father eventually went with 100 other teenagers from Italy to, into Italy, and then on a ship Galilee to Palestine, he also started to write. So there were letters that we found, and you, how about you tell us your story again of how you actually discovered the letters, and then I'll share with the audience a similar story on how I found, or my sister found these letters that I'm speaking about.
Yeah, well, as I said, I found this box of old letters in my parents' attic, and
Was there something that forced you to decide to go into the attic? I mean, not everyone just, out of the blue goes into the attic.
Oh, well, that's where we stored various things. And I was probably looking for something else. And you know how that works, and stumbled upon this box. And, I was a reporter, I'm a journalist by profession. So curiosity is kind of like my middle name. So you find that box of old documents, of course, you're going to want to see what they are. And I should also mention that, the letters between my father and grandfather were in German. So I don't speak German, so I couldn't understand that stuff. And I had to ask a cousin of mine in England who's fluent in German to translate. So he and also I have a good German-American friend here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So between the two of them, I divided the letters up, and they were very generous and kind to, provide the translations, because otherwise it wasn't like I read the letters and immediately knew what they were. I knew they were correspondence between my father and grandfather, but didn't know the content. Now, the other letters that were my father had written to various immigration agencies and government agencies, trying to arrange to get my grandfather a visa, so there were letters that, and these were all in English. So I understood, he was writing to the American consulate in Stuttgart, which is the consulate that was going to handle the visa for my grandfather. So there was another thing about the letters that was actually kind of heartbreaking, was that at various times they came very close, it seemed, to succeeding in getting my grandfather out. There was, they actually managed to get a visa, which was, by the way, extremely difficult. I mean, there were, as Jeffrey, you probably know, there were limitations on the number of visas, as there are now, that are issued for each country. And even despite the fact that, there was a war going on and there were all these desperate Jewish people trying to escape, the Nazi regime, there was still very limited spots available. I don't know the numbers offhand, but I do remember that it's something like 10 times as many people were applying for a visa in this period than were available. So you can imagine, you had a 1 out of 10 chance of getting a visa. And finally, my grandfather succeeded in getting a visa, but unfortunately, he couldn't arrange to get a berth on a ship sailing to the United States. So it was, there were several sort of close calls like that where they apparently, they're just thwarted in their efforts.
So how did your father, and did you know the story of how your father got out of Bavaria and got that one of those visas? Because it was in 1939. It wasn't easy then either.
38.
38.
It wasn't easy, but it was, it got progressively more difficult. And then at one point, at some point, basically the escape hatches were all sealed and no one could get out. But yeah, my father, he was fortunate. He got out in, I'm sorry, did I say 38? He got out in 37, November of 37, I believe. Yeah. So yeah, it was still difficult, but there was at some points, up until a certain point, the Nazis were actually encouraging immigration because they wanted, that was before the sort of the final solution was implemented, where, basically they decided they were going to just exterminate the entire Jewish population of Germany and other parts of Europe. So this was before the final solution was implemented. And at that point, they were sort of encouraging Jews to leave. They wanted to, as they say in German, get rid of, well, I forgot the German term, but it's basically get rid of all the Jews.
So so coming back, we'll share a little bit of our, so it was interesting that you said that you had the opportunity to have the translations. What kind of paper were they on?
They're on onion skin for the most part. Yeah.
So if I can relay a little story, when my mother passed away in 2011, my sister, who's living in Boston, I was in Minnesota at the time, Minneapolis. So she went in to help my father and to move my father up to Massachusetts. My mother was primarily the caregiver of my father. My mother passed away and she was 83 and my father was 93. He passed away in 2012. And she was cleaning out the house, and on the nightstand to the of my mother, my sister was cleaning out all the stuff, and there was a box in the back of the nightstand. And when she opened that up, she realized there were 16 different letters with different dates on them. And again, we, as you, do not speak German, and we knew these were on onion skin, and we had no clue what those letters said, meant to the family. In fact, my sister brought these letters to my father when they were together up in Massachusetts, and he told her to throw them away.
Oh my gosh.
Because again, my parents wanted nothing to do with their pre-Holocaust experience. They wanted to just wipe all those memories away. Now, from a standpoint of getting them translated, my sister from 2011 tried in Massachusetts at all the major universities, German departments, to get those letters transferred, and she had virtually no luck. It was interesting because you said you mentioned Stuttgart. My father originally, and his mother and father originally, he was born in Stuttgart, and they lived in Stuttgart, and eventually they early on moved into Berlin. But it wasn't until 2020 that I started with the Facebook opportunity, and I was doing research on Facebook on opening and founding the group that you're participating in, the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and now on YouTube, that I found a admin who is involved in the Jenks Facebook group, Vera Myers. And Vera Myers led me to another person, Michael Simonson from Leo Beck Institute in New York City. And Michael, I called and spoke to Michael. He translated all 16 letters for us during COVID at the time. And it was a very difficult hardship because the only translators that he had were older people, and they were all working from home. So it took probably 6 months for us to get those letters transferred. And the letters are really not only showed a personal side of my grandfather, who I never knew, and his love for his two sons, it also showed me a side of my father, which I never could peel off, how he was trying to get his father to Palestine from 1935 to 1939 when the letter stopped. And I think that was because of the war. So it's really, we share many common threads here in this. So what else did you learn from the letters?
I guess I just learned a bit about the hardships they encountered, and having to move so often, and having apparently not enough funds. Yeah, that was another thing. My grandfather was a rather affluent man at one point. He was the owner of a large glassmaking company, and that they had, they were quite well off. And to see him, struggling, not having enough money to eat, or to eat properly, it was really, it was quite sad. And also, I learned about the fact that even the funds that they did have, because they did sell the house, and they realized a sizable amount of money, although I learned later that the house was sold for much less than the market value, because this was typical under the Nazi era. They forced the Jews to sell their property, but they were forced to sell at a much lower price than they would get on the market. But they also made it very difficult to access the funds that they did have, because they were forced to put them into accounts that were restricted. And so even though there was funds in these accounts, oh, and by the way, I should mention my grandfather was one of 12 children. So the house was he lived in it, but it was actually jointly owned by his siblings. So even though they got a pretty good amount of money from the sale of the house, they had to divide that. Well, at that point, I think there were only about 8 or 9 surviving siblings, but so the money that was available was quite limited for each one, and then they couldn't access it because of the restrictions the regime had placed on Nazi bank accounts. So that's another thing I learned from the letters, that it was a struggle for him to get money from his own accounts. It was also very difficult to bring money in. My father tried to send him money, and some of it never got through. I don't know the details, but financially, it was very difficult to survive because the regime, the Nazi regime, was making it as difficult as possible. And also, it was difficult for people who emigrated out of Germany, German Jewish people, to bring any assets with them, because that's another thing the Nazis restricted severely, was the ability to export, any funds or assets.
And to that point, how much money did your father come to the United States with?
Well, I think I mentioned in an earlier interview that there was restrictions to the point where I think they could only bring about $5 in cash. So it's, the equivalent of $5.
Yeah, so that's amazing. So now let's take it a little bit further. And we also have commonality here. So I think our audience would like to know how you came upon understanding the whereabouts and the next stages of your grandfather's life. So why don't you walk us through the research that you did, how you became knowledgeable about the whereabouts of your grandfather, and unfortunately the circumstances that transpired.
Well, I was fortunate in the sense that I had a cousin who I mentioned earlier in England who was very engaged with research on our joint family, because we shared the same great grandparents, and he was actually affiliated with the Wiener Library Holocaust repository in London. So he was able to do a lot of research through the Wiener Library and also through other channels like Yad Vashem and Israel's, another major repository. So I was fortunate that, being that he was fluent in German, he was able to obtain some details about he found my grandfather's death certificate from Theresienstadt, which is where he was deported to. I don't think.
When was that, Peter?
When did my grandfather die?
No, when was he deported?
He was deported in August of 41, and he was, murdered in December of that year, December 27th. So he was in Theresienstadt about a little over 3 months before he died.
So it was in 41.
I'm sorry, a little over 4 months before he died.
Yeah.
Yes, 1941. No, I'm sorry, 1942.
Okay.
I'm sorry, 42. He was deported in 42.
And so how did this research of the letters, how did they impact your writing of the book, or didn't it?
Oh, I think it did, in the sense that, I mean, the letters, you can do research and get documentation and historical facts about events and places, right? But to actually hear the story through the voices of the people who are actually experience it is a whole different thing. And obviously when it's your father and grandfather, whom I never met. So by the time I finished writing my book, I felt like I knew my grandfather. Because another thing that I've mentioned and that we both share, Jeffrey, is that my father never talked about his family, never talked about his life in Germany. All I knew is that my grandfather died in a concentration camp. And that was all I knew about my grandfather. Basically, that in addition to the album of photos that my father brought over, which showed my grandfather, you know, in front of his home, you know, in the Alps, you know, on vacation and ski resorts, walking in the Bavarian hills, you know. So I had images, but never any real details about, you know, never hearing his voice. So these letters sort of, you know, obviously, yeah, I mean, I could hear his words, you know, spoken, and so that made a big impact on yeah, on the book, and how, in fact, just the idea of writing the book, I think the letters played a big part in motivating me, to inspiring me to write the book.
And so it's interesting this because, again, my grandfather was also deported from Berlin to Terezin. He was deported in October of 1942, and he was murdered there in May of 1942. And it
43.
I'm sorry, 43. You're right. Apologize. So he had a significant amount of time there, which was surprising to me. And what I just actually found out just recently from another colleague is that most of the people died in Terezin. They didn't exterminate them. They just had massive amounts of disease, certainly malnutrition. And so there wasn't any crematorium executions there, or I don't think there was many even people getting shot. They were all just dying from just being sick and starving.
Malnutrition, disease, overwork. There was a crematorium that was built, but it was not to murder people, but to dispose of their remains.
Yeah.
And yeah, so you're right. It wasn't an extermination camp. It was a ghetto, but the conditions were deplorable. And there was a second, Theresienstadt was divided into two major areas. There was the main port, the main city, and then there's something called the small fortress, or little fortress. And there they actually did do, I mean, I think people were murdered. They were kept under the abysmal conditions. Some of them were locked in these cages, or very small cells with, you know, in isolation and naked. So that part of the Theresienstadt was actually, it wasn't per se extermination, but it was incredibly, from what I understand, brutal.
So having researched the letters, and if you could tell our audience one memory about your father that sticks with you, and another memory of your grandfather that sticks with you from these letters, and we'll use that to wrap up this part of the interview.
Well, I think one of the notes my father wrote was telling my grandfather that he himself was not feeling well, and was actually losing weight, which, you know, he was a 30-year-old ostensibly healthy man, but he said that he'd been in the States about 4 or 5 years by that time. He said he'd only had a few days of vacation, and he was not sleeping well, and, you know, he was losing weight. And I think that sort of reflected, perhaps, I mean, from what I took out of it, was that he was so stressed out by this situation, because first of all, he had to make a living. He was a door-to-door salesman, I think, at that point. And he also had to deal with trying to rescue his father. in one of the letters, he said he spent a whole day in New York going from one shipping line to another, trying to secure a berth for my grandfather on a passenger ship to the States. And so so the frustrations I think he felt, the stress he felt, maybe he felt even guilty that he left without, and left his father behind. I mean, I didn't see that specifically, but that might have played a part in his anxiety and stress.
Now, before you get to your grandfather, did your grandfather want to come? He obviously wanted to come, but it was an
Well,
immediate want, or it took a while for him to convince himself to come.
I think, like a lot of other Jews, initially he didn't think that things would get as bad as they did. And, so I think, when my father came over in 1937, obviously my grandfather decided to stay behind. I mean, he could have very likely have come with my father at that point, but I think he didn't feel that he wanted to start life over and that things were not going to get as bad as they got. And so, but then in the letters that I discovered in the attic, it became clear at that point that my grandfather was convinced that he had to get out if he was going to survive. So that became, manifestly clear in the letters that he was all in on getting out, because at that point, the writing was on the wall.
So leave us with a memory that you have from the letters about your grandfather.
Well, I think what I mentioned before is what really sticks to me, the fact that he said, if you ever are lucky, if I am ever lucky enough to see you again, you'll meet a scrawny man. And this was, to me was, kind of sad. So that was the memory that stuck with me.
Okay, well, we're talking to Peter Kupfer, and his book is The Glassmaker's Son, and it's going to be published in, I believe, November of 2022, and we're so thrilled to have Peter giving us such an amazing historical perspective about the book and his father and grandfather. He's going to return for our last interview about some portraits that he became available to him, and the story behind these such family portraits that he wants to share. So come back for our next interview on the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance. Thanks for being with us, and see you the next time.